it is the time of year when we start asking the question about interseeding legumes. And so the talk tonight will focus on that. We really want to ask four questions, and that is, let's revisit why we do have these legumes interseeded. I think Valerie just mentioned a couple of good reasons. We also want to talk about how to interseed, and there's some do's and don'ts. Which legumes are best for Missouri, which ones are not good for Missouri, and which ones are not good to interseed anyway. And what rates do we recommend? And then finally, we want to talk a little bit about spring management. So let's begin about why interseed legumes. We know the reasons. We may not remember all the reasons. The most obvious reason, I'm really glad that Valerie pointed out red and white clover and annual lespedeza, because those are the big three that we talk about interseeding in Missouri. And the reasons are, as she said, it evens out the seasonal yield. Our problem with tall fescue is not yield, it's yield distribution. And the bimodal curve you see there with 2/3 of growth and the spring, followed by this slump in the summer and another 1/3 in the fall, that curve follows the temperature. And so if we can add red and white clover, we cover some of that gap. Another reason is because legumes are higher quality. There's more nutritive value. And we're going to speak in general terms here. And when we say that legumes have more crude protein than grasses, we're talking about our common perennial grasses. And so here's the study from Slew and Moore up at Iowa State. And they compared alfalfa and trefoil to smooth brome grass and orchard grass. Quite a bit more protein. That's not surprising. They also reported digestibility and slightly better digestibility. Now remember, this is comparing perennials, and most of our pastures are perennials, so it's applicable. We also know that legumes have higher mineral content, particularly with calcium, magnesium, copper, zinc, and a few others. And this is a study. It's a very busy slide, so we overlaid some bright green bars so that you can see the portions to focus on. The calcium in alfalfa, white clover, red clover, alsite clover is 2 to 3 times as high as you would have in a meadow fescue, perennial ryegrass, smooth brome grass, or orchard grass, what they call cocksfoot. This is from Lithuania. But this is just a sampling. There are a lot of other data that show the same thing. They also showed higher magnesium for those legumes versus those grasses. It's not surprising. So much higher in nutritive value, including the energy, the protein, and the minerals. And there are other minerals. Also, in the case of red clover can act as a vasorelaxant. As you know, when our cattle are grazing tall fescue, they experience vasoconstriction, which is a narrowing of the blood vessels, and that prevents good blood flow. So this time of year, that's why we see fescue foot and things like that. And that's why in the summer, we think that's why we see heat stresses, because the blood isn't circulating, and so it builds up heat in the core body. Red clover, this is a slide from the USDA group affiliated with University of Kentucky, and ultrasonograph showing on the left vasoconstriction. That's a cross section of a vessel that's shrunk, and over on the right, vasorelaxation. And that's caused by biochanin A, which is in red clover. So there's another reason that we like to see legumes in our pastures. Legumes also, as mentioned earlier, can dilute the tall fescue pasture. It's not saying it's diluting the alkaloids necessarily in the bloodstream and so on, but it will do that if the pasture itself is diluted. And this is an old slide taken up at Linnaeus, and it shows tall fescue, smooth brome grass, orchard grass. But Also these legumes, red and white clover and birchfoot trefoil. Two of those, as we said earlier, red clover and white clover, are fairly easy to interseed by frost seeding. Clover also, as we know, can increase steer gains. This is a study from Paul Beck at University of Arkansas. This is spring grazing. I believe it was over 4 years. And he showed that there was, in his study, a 0.4 of a pound increase in gain, in steer gain. And that occurred whether or not the fescue was Kentucky 31 toxic or was one of these novels. And I'm going to move on, but before I do, I want to say another thing he stated in that study was that the novel endophytes resulted in profitability at least 3 times greater for stocker steers than it did for Kentucky 31. It has a huge impact, but if you add the clover, you still get that bump. This is a study from University of Tennessee, Thompson and Henry Freeborg and others. And what this is really a review paper. And for those researchers on the line, they compiled data from 17 site years. So I think this would be pretty representative. And it's kind of what we expect. What they did is they looked at the impact of clover and non-clover on low endophyte fescue, moderate endophyte, that would be something like a 40%, or high endophyte tall fescue, 65% and over. And you can see that the clover added that bump that we talk about. It's not going to do, as we see on the previous slide here, it's not going to take our daily gain from 0.9 clear up to 2 or something like that. It just takes it up a bump, an increment. And that's pretty well known. So here's some relevant studies. We don't want to forget that the legumes also fix nitrogen. And this is also a review paper that shows how much nitrogen was fixed in these various studies. And of course, alfalfa fixes quite a bit. There's quite a range. White clover is the king of fixation as far as our pasture legumes, and then red clover. But look at this column here. It shows how much was transferred into the grass. And that's why people like white clover. So much white clover nitrogen, that so much nitrogen fixed from white clover will be taken up by the grass. We also want to talk about how to frost seed. It's straightforward. One of the easiest things that we do, we basically just spread it either by hand. The whirlybird here on the upper left is what is used mainly for food plots, but we can also hook up a spreader to a 4-wheel or to a tractor and just let the seed fall on the ground. Broadcast alone or with a so-called extender. Now, a lot of people mix their seed with fertilizer. And if people are going to mix it with the fertilizer, that's okay if they spread it immediately. Wouldn't let it sit an hour. And that's because some of our fertilizers, nitrogen, potassium, are deliquescent. They will suck the moisture right out of the seed. But anyway, also, we want to spread the seed late winter. Now, what does that mean? Because late winter could be March the 19th. And we don't want to go into March. In the Ozarks, probably on the Arkansas border, we could spread maybe as early as late January. In North Missouri, late February. When I first moved to Missouri, I was advised to spread it on the last snow of the year. I always found that kind of odd because I checked the calendar and just couldn't ever find the last snow of the year. But the point is, at a time when you can see snow, that allows you to see the rows or where you've been. It needs to be frozen ground so there's no rutting. And that's the time of the year where there's the seed will be drawn into the soil by the freezing and thawing of the soil. Don't want to go too early because we could get that really warm week that allows the seed to germinate and come up, and then we'd get a sheet of ice on it the following week. So it's a little compromise. some of the problems that we have. This is the number one problem that I see and that I hear about. Some of our students have done this, is spread seed on a pasture, broadcast it just like they know to do, but didn't pay attention to the residue. And of course, the seed stays on top of that thatch. It's not going to have good seed soil contact. That's the number one problem that we see and hear about. We can overcome that if we've got the cattle already in the area, just let them hoof it in. There are reasons, known reasons why forage seedlings fail, and this is Jerry Nelson's textbook. It's written at the time with Jerry here and Barnes at Wisconsin, Collins in Kentucky, and Kenmore at Iowa State. It's a classic, and there is a chapter in that book that talks about seedling failure, establishment failure, and they categorize failure in terms of failure to germinate, failure to survive after germination, and failure to survive after establishment. Many, many reasons. What we want to do right now is look at the reasons why interseeded legumes, frost-seeded legumes in particular, why they fail. And the reasons that they don't germinate, there's always the risk of poor quality seed. We know that. But again, the number one reason is they're just not down in the soil. And they may germinate on top of the soil and just shrivel up, but there is the possibility that they germinate and they die because of freezing, late or an untimely freeze, or because of waterlogging. And then they die because after they come up and are well established, the field will experience drought or waterlogging. And in terms of an established stand of seedlings of legumes in a grass pasture, this bottom one, the last one, is grass competition. That's the number one problem that we see or hear about after the seedlings are established. Which legumes do we want to see frost seeded in Missouri and what rate? Well, there's a guide. You can get it on the extension website and download it. I think it's pretty good. We've looked at it every 3 or 4 years, not a lot really to edit on that. And we like to see these, as we mentioned, mainly red clover, white clover, and annual espadiza, sometimes Alsike clover. But the big three at the top are the most common. The white clover is interesting. Sometimes you'll see seeding recommendations, 1 pound to 5 pounds of white clover. And white clover, the seed is so small, 2 pounds is really plenty. 3 if you just want to, I don't know, for whatever reason, put on more white clover. But if you put on 2 pounds of white clover and don't get a white clover stand, there's something else wrong. It's not the seeding rate. There's something else going on. Other states report, to the north of us, report their recommended seeding rates. And you'll see, as part of a mixture, they have ladino or white clover 1 to 2 pounds, which is understandable. Now, there is a land-grant university that recommends up to 5 pounds, but there's not a good reason for that, I don't think. Wisconsin basically reports the same thing that Minnesota reports. We don't like to see in our state bird's foot trefoil or alfalfa frost seeded. And the reasons are, in the case of alfalfa, we get spring freezes, late winter freezes, whatever you want to call it. The same thing happens with an established stand of tall fescue. It could be a 2-year-old stand. It's planted with the wrong dormancy class, so it breaks dormancy once we have that warm spell, which we do. And then it comes up, depletes all the carbohydrates, and can't regrow if a freeze comes along. So it's susceptible to winter kill. In the case of bird's foot trefoil, we don't like to see bird's foot trefoil interseeded into a sod because it has such poor seedling vigor, it hardly ever gets going. Most of the time we have trefoil, seeded into a pasture. It's at establishment, or we've done something like spray, or we've done something to manage the canopy. It has a tough time competing with the grass. In terms of spring management, and I'm going to mention some of these things, and I'm going to ask Ryan to comment, but in terms of spring management, really what we're talking about is managing the canopy. And I want to show this and let Ryan talk about this. This is the impact of nitrogen on light coming into the grass canopy. Ryan?
So as Craig described, competition from the grass is one of the biggest problems we see with keeping these young seedlings growing and staying competitive. I think we're introducing here the notion of trying to limit the nitrogen fertilizer that we might apply in spring. So if you intend to broadcast clover seed in February, then you've probably already made the decision that you're not going to apply nitrogen on those acres in the spring. And we would make that recommendation to give the clover seedlings their best opportunity to survive. If you do put nitrogen fertilizer on, this graph shows on the left side, no nitrogen applied, and the photosynthetically active radiation is about 6 micromoles per square meter. Okay, so that's like the natural penetration of light. And if you put on 50 or 100 pounds of, let's see, it'd be like kilograms per hectare is about, well, pounds per acre is about 0.9 of kilograms per hectare. So, 40 to 90 pounds per acre of nitrogen really suppresses the amount of light penetration that we see into the canopy. That's not doing any favors for the clover seedlings. And so the black circles you see that are decreasing, that's the total radiation. Another important component to clover survivability and physiological aspects of the clover success has to do with the ratio of different spectrums of light. So the ratio of red to far red is an important factor to how many growing points there are on the clover plants. And so you're doing disfavor to the clover by fertilizing, causing the grass to outgrow the clover seedlings, and basically shading them out by total light and affecting the quality of the red to far red ratio.
Right. So
that's my explanation, Craig.
Yeah. So it's the amount of light and the quality of light measured by the red and far red ratio. But anyways, you can see here what just a little bit of nitrogen will do here, and it starts taking it down right away, that light penetration. Thanks, Ryan. The other thing to remember is that nitrogen fertilizer, as we know, increases grass competition and decreases the amount of clover that's there. This is measured over 4 years. This is studied by Kallenbach and several. And, there is such thing as a red clover year, a white clover year. Year 2, quite a bit of red clover, but you can see with only 50 pounds of nitrogen, it starts dropping. And by the time you've added 100, you start cutting those plants right away, even though it's a good clover year. So nitrogen is not good. We saw this in the flood year, the 1993 flood. A lot of people, in that year, what we were hearing about was the amount of wheat we lost, the amount of corn we lost, the amount of soybeans that we lost, because they were grown in those flatlands or alluvial plains. But we lost a lot of forage as well in the uplands, simply because so much rain came and it was a waterlogged soil. So in 1993, a lot of people had fertilized their mixed pastures thinking, I'm going to get in there and cut that grass and make some hay. And they didn't. They couldn't get in. And so that just laid, all that grass laid on the clover like a bad haircut, and it just smothered it. I would say also that it drowned out the rhizobia, so it cut the infixation. But anyway, nitrogen, when we put nitrogen on a field and we're trying to keep a clover and especially get the clover established, we're creating problems. We have to, if we do that, we have to be very careful how much we put on and make sure that we get the canopy off. This is that same slide that we saw earlier. We were looking at growth curves and yield curves. But as we look at this, the point that we want to make is the grass canopy fluctuates. There is such a thing as a seasonal canopy. And so grass competition for red and white clover, pretty serious. Grass competition for annual Lespedeza, not so much, because as Valerie said, in southern Missouri, you'll see it coming on late May and early June, and of course later in northern Missouri. This is a slide that we show often. This is Jesse Dowdy's farm near Tuscumbia. This is an old slide, but he had just cut hay. It was about third week or toward the end of May, and it looks like a stand of tall fescue, pure tall fescue. But if you take the camera and just take a shot straight down, you can see all of that Lespedeza sitting there ready to take off and express. And Lespedeza is a little bit shade tolerant. It will germinate and stay under the canopy for quite a while. All you have to do is remove the canopy. So the point is that that if you do have nitrogen, it's not as much of a risk on the annual Lespedeza. Nitrogen also reduces biological infixation. As we said earlier, one of the reasons we like legumes is because pasture legumes is because they reduce the amount of purchased fertilizer that we have to that we want to apply to the soil. And I hesitate to show this slide because it's from a soybean study, and even worse, it's from a pot study. But it's really the most simple thing to see, and a lot of classic work on this was done at Ohio State by Streeter, and you can see here that adding, and this is micromolars, but what was that, Ryan? Is that turning out to be 10 pounds of nitrogen? I can't remember what it was. Yeah, 10 pounds. Okay. With just a little bit of nitrogen, you can see that all of the nodules and the infixation takes a sharp decrease right away. So I'm sure there are some studies with pasture legumes. I didn't find those, but this is the classic research right here. So let's summarize what we're saying here. Legumes, just as a reminder, they increase the nutritive value. They lower the toxicity of the pasture. They also red clover in some cases can lower the vasoconstriction. Increase animal performance is easiest to see in the gain. Also, it evens out the yield distribution and adds nitrogen to the soil. When we want to get clovers established, clovers are annual Lespedeza, broadcasting late January or in February in Missouri. We like to see, as we said several times, red clover, white clover, and annual Lespedeza. We would like people to use the University of Missouri seeding rates. There are some seeding rates out there that look awfully expensive, not for really any good reason to us. Don't add much nitrogen in the spring. We understand that if we're adding DAP, that we're going to pick up some nitrogen, but low amounts. And then also manage the canopy.